you learn about turtles? All right, that's good. So we're continuing to talk about marshes, and that is chapter 12. We're basically on page 274. Did we talk about water clarity in marshes? How you can't see very well through the water in marshes? We did this, didn't we?
Yeah.
Because there's sediments built up. And what happens, especially around here where we have strong tides, the tide comes in, it stirs up the mud gets suspended into the water, and then the tide goes out and it pulls the mud with it. And that's why the water is so cloudy and brown around here. You don't get brown, cloudy water in Miami because there's not as much marsh. And there's not as strong tides. So here you see the book talks about how the marsh acts as a nursery. When fish come out to sea, when they get big enough, here's a couple fish that are 2 or 3 years old. They spawn, and the eggs and sperm go into the water, and you can see that here. And then the eggs hatch and form larvae. That's baby fish. The baby fish will swim back into a marsh, into an estuary, and up these tidal creeks. Why would baby fish want to go into these tidal creeks? Why not just live out in the middle of the ocean? There's several reasons.
It's harsh out in the ocean.
It's harsh out in the ocean, you might get eaten. That's one reason. What's another reason?
It's easier to get food.
It's easier to get food. See, the marshes have real high, what we call productivity. That means the grasses of the marsh are doing lots of photosynthesis, making lots of food. And then things will eat the grasses, like little snails and such. And the fish will be able to eat the little snails. There's lots of food in the marsh. There's a whole food chain, a food web. And so these the baby fish do well here. So they swim around here, they eat as much as they can. And then when they get older, they leave and come out into the ocean and then grow into their full size. It's also why you see a lot of birds in the marsh, because the birds are eating the fish. Often in marshes you see what we call mud flats. The bottoms of estuaries become exposed at low tide and form mud flats. And again, it's has to do with elevation. I'll move this for you. You draw a little rising elevation. And here's the ocean water at low tide. This is the low tide. And then when the tide comes in, it goes way up. So it might come way up to here. That's high tide. And so a marsh is grasses that are growing here between the low tide and the high tide area. You see? But this area where the water comes up about high tide, that often is, you don't see any growth of grass there. And the reason why is because this area is only covered by water for a little bit of time. And then when the tide goes back down, the water goes out, that water evaporates very quickly. It has a lot of time to evaporate, the water that's left on the mud there. And that water evaporates and leaves the salt behind. The water down here has less time to evaporate because it's underwater for longer. So this isn't as salty as this area. This area is the saltiest because it just gets covered for a second, and salt water gets up there, and then over the next several hours it evaporates. You're left with real salty soil. Too salty for the marsh grass to live. That's a mud flat. So you see these, there's the grass near the ocean, and then behind it you get these mud flats. And then as you go above the high tide mark, you get more grasses that are different types of grasses that survive where these hardly ever get salt water, only a couple times a month. So this is a different kind of grass than this. This is usually that spartina, that type of grass. And this will be something different, like there's the pickleweed or something like that only gets covered up every once in a while. What do you? Glasswort, all those different marsh plants. They live further up where they don't get covered as often. So it's all about elevation in a marsh. Here are some of the little snails that one of the things you'll see on these mud flats is the surface looks kind of golden sometimes, or green. And algae can often grow in that salt environment. So sometimes you have algae growing. And these little snails will eat the algae. They'll crawl along and eat algae. That's one of the things that they like. Often you'll see them crawling on the blades of marsh grass too. Have you ever seen those little periwinkle snails? And they're eating algae off the side of the marsh grass. So the marsh grass plants themselves have algae growing on them. And the snails will eat algae off the sides of the marsh grass. So that's the beginning of the food chain too. And then the baby crabs and fish will eat these snails. And birds will eat these snails too. This is called a California horn snail. It's not the periwinkle snail that we have around here. A lot of times on the mud flats you see fiddler crabs. Fiddler crabs, what they'll do is they eat mud. They don't eat the mud itself, but the mud is covered in algae. So they'll take the mud into their mouth, and using their mouth parts, they'll clean all the algae off the mud. And then they'll spit it out, and it comes out in a little ball. You see those little balls lying all around? That's mud that's been through the mouth of this crab, getting algae off of it. And they'll eat, the fiddler crabs will eat other stuff too. But algae is one of their main things. And then they have this big claw, and that claw is for signaling. It's for sexual reproduction. The crabs with the biggest claws get the girl. And so they'll come out of their holes and they'll wave, and that means come on over here. I got a big claw over here. And the female will go over there and mate with them. If you've ever tried to pick up a fiddler crab by its claw, it can lose the claw very easily to escape predators. And then it'll grow back a new claw if it lives long enough. Try it sometime. Kind of a mean thing to do, I guess, but anyway. They'll pinch you with the claw too. It shows a lot of other things living in the mud flats. A lot of things burrow down into the mud, and usually the tube allows oxygen to get down to them because they have to have oxygen. But you can see ghost shrimp. A lot of the holes that you see on the beach at low tide, if you're walking along the beach, you see little holes. There are little ghost shrimp living in those holes. And you can if you ever take a big shovel, try this next time you go to the beach, take a shovel and dig way down where you see one of those holes, and then get a sieve, you know, like like that you put pasta through or something like that. You know what I'm talking about? Or any kind of small mesh screen, and put the sand on the sieve, and just take a bucket and pour water through it, and all the sand grains are small. They'll wash out, and you'll be left with a little shrimp there. The birds will eat these. Have you ever seen those little birds that are going along the edge and just pushing their head into the sand, their beak into the sand? They can sense these things. They can either see them or smell them, and they'll eat some of these little critters that are in here. The ghost shrimp will often burrow too deep for those birds to get to, but there are other little snails and things that are burrowed in the sand. Little worms. See this sandworm right here? The birds will get. There's all sorts of little worms and things. Clams. Look at the fat innkeeper. That's an interesting name. It's a type of worm. Urechus calpo. Often you see the birds. Have you ever noticed those birds will run right where the water comes up to and breaks? And they're running right along that edge there? It's because when the water comes up, the water jostles about the sand grains. And so right when the sand grains get turned over, that's when these little things get exposed. Some of the little organisms, they're tiny, they're barely visible, and they only live a couple sand grains down under the sand. So when the water comes in, it jostles the sand grains about, and it exposes these little creatures. And the creatures will dig back down a little bit. So it's that time, right when the water comes up, when they're exposed and the birds can find them. So that's why the birds run right along the edge. Isn't that cool? Here you see these things are real small and pretty shallow compared to the different birds. So the birds can reach down and get them. And the birds have real good senses for finding these things. Sight and smell. They can figure out where these things are. That's how they survive. Different birds eat different things. We call that resource partitioning. Different birds have evolved to eat different things, so they don't have to compete with one another too much. If one bird came around that could eat all of these things, then you wouldn't have as high diversity as you do. This is just showing kind of how they do it. There's different paths you find, different birds walk. So we call it, the salt marsh is where we have vegetation. The vegetated area of an estuary is called the salt marsh. So that's where there's plants growing. So actually the mudflat isn't technically part of the salt marsh because there's no plants growing there. But we kind of call it salt marsh because it's all that area. But the salt marsh includes where the plants grow. And it's Spartina. That's the species that dominates almost all estuaries in the country. Until you get to the tropical areas. You know what dominates when you get further south? Like in the tip of Florida and down in the Caribbean? Mangroves. Mangroves grow where Spartina cannot in those hotter temperatures. Spartina needs a little cooler temperatures.
Could mangroves grow here?
Nope, it's not hot enough. They can't survive here. South Florida you don't see mangroves until you get that far south. Needle rush, is that black grass that's a little bit longer and pointy that would actually hurts when you touch it. And needle rush is found in areas where there's lower salinity. So what you'll get is you get this area is Spartina. This is Spartina. And up where the salinity starts to get higher near the mud flat, that's where you'll get needle rush. And it's a little bit blacker grass, and it's a little longer. Needle rush. And really, needle rush and Spartina are about the only two species that can survive in the marsh. So, when you go out and look at a marsh, it all looks the same. Because it's just two species. And so it's pretty uniform looking. I remember a lady on the bus seeing the marsh. She's riding over the causeway, and she said, "Who has to mow all that?" That was funny. So here we go. So here's at the high tide line, the water comes all the way up to where the plants are growing. This isn't showing it like the other one, like I have it here, with the mud flats behind it. This is the low tide. This is the mud flats that are exposed to low tide, like near the beach, which are also mud flats. But these mud flats aren't due to salt. It's due to being so flooded for so long. So you get a form of mud flat right here too. Right here, this is the beach mud flat. Call it the beach mud flat. That's what, you know, when the tide goes out and you're walking at low tide and you're on the muddy area with all the little holes. That's a different kind of mud flat. It's not caused by too much salt. It's caused by, it's flooded by water for so long you can't get the plant growth there. That's showing that right here. It's not showing the salt mud flat that's further up. So, again, this is basically the drawing I have. I guess I could have just come to it. Here we have growing below low tide. You get your grasses like eelgrass or manatee grass. Do you remember we studied those grasses? They can grow below low tide. They have to these kind of grasses have to always be covered by water. You don't see those around here because the water's too muddy. The water here is so muddy that light can't get through to any grasses growing on the bottom. So we don't have any of these seagrasses in our waterways. But there are some areas where the water is not as muddy as ours, and you get these grasses growing on the bottom of these marsh rivers. Then you go up, and like I drew here, here's the smooth cordgrass, and the different types of cordgrass here. They don't show the needle rush here, but it would be higher up. And then this pickleweed, or I forgot it again.
Glasswort.
Glasswort, or saltwort. Those grow in areas that only get flooded every once in a while. I got a little video here introducing the marsh to us. By the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Welcome to the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge. Founded in 1966, it was named after the legendary Rachel Carson. Established in order to protect valuable salt marsh and estuarine habitat for migratory birds, it is part of a system of more than 500 national wildlife refuges. As a resident or visitor to southern Maine, you may see our blue goose signs at the edge of the woods or along a salt marsh. These salt marshes support the purpose of the refuge in a number of ways. But what exactly is a salt marsh? Salt marshes are grass-dominated ecosystems that form where rivers meet the sea. Some develop behind barrier islands like the Webb Hannet Marsh, others along rivers like the Spurwink or York. While salt marshes support a number of beautiful but diminutive flowers, they are dominated by grasses that can tolerate being periodically flooded by salty tidal waters. The two most common grasses mark the two main areas of the marsh. Cordgrass grows at lower elevations in the low marsh and is flooded on most high tides. Salt hay grows at higher elevations in the high marsh and is flooded only on the largest spring tides of the month. Spring tides are associated with full and new moons. In Maine, in contrast to other areas of the U.S., only 5 to 8 of these tides flood the high marsh in any given month. Tidal flooding, in just the right amounts, brings moisture, nutrients, and dissolved oxygen. These all help the marsh plants to grow abundant leaves and robust roots. Roots and old leaves form the dark peat, which protects our shores and provides homes for abundant wildlife. Perhaps you have seen some of them: rib mussels, American black ducks, mummichugs, snowy egrets, great blue herons, and sharp-tailed sparrows. Although salt marsh conditions are harsh, with high salinities, flooding, freezing, baking, organisms that can survive these stresses thrive. Salt marshes are among the most productive ecosystems in the world, vying with cornfields and tropical forests. Energy is also woven into the estuarine food web. Salt marshes transform sunlight and carbon dioxide into plants, fish, birds, otters, even people. Our offshore fisheries depend on the energy exported by healthy estuaries and salt marshes. The delicate balance of life in a salt marsh has been challenged repeatedly over the last 350 years. The marshes at Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge still bear the remnants of dikes built in the 1800s for salt hay harvesting. Ditches were dug in many East Coast marshes for agriculture and mosquito control. Road crossings have reduced tidal flow to upstream areas, resulting in marsh subsidence and conversion to non-native invasive plants. Stormwater runoff and creek diversions have also degraded the salt marshes. And from one settled area to another, people have effectively eliminated these ecosystems by filling and draining them. And so we depend ever increasingly on smaller and smaller salt marshes. But now global climate change and sea level rise threaten even the marsh's ability to provide us with their invaluable benefits. These benefits include converting sunlight and CO2 into plants, transforming that energy base into a multitude of creatures, cycling nutrients, transforming pollutants, trapping sediments, controlling floods, providing protection from storm surges and wave erosion, and renewing the human heart through their beauty. As part of the Land Management Research and Demonstration Program at the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, we're investigating ways to restore degraded marshes and increase the resilience of existing marshes so that future generations will be able to share the benefits we've enjoyed. You can help too. Honor the blue goose signs by keeping a respectful distance. These areas are sensitive ecosystems. Wildlife here are either raising young or resting during their arduous migrations. Dispose of litter and recyclables properly. Animals are curious and may eat or become entangled in debris. Yard waste also destroys fragile transition habitats, assists invasive plants, and ruins everyone's view. Have a wildlife-friendly yard. Plant only native species. Keep areas that border salt marshes in dense woody vegetation. And minimize your use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Remember, what goes on lawns often washes off into nearby waterways and wetlands. But most importantly, enjoy. Rachel Carson not only fought to keep the environment safe from pollutants, she emphasized the need to share our joy in the living planet. For all of us, young and old alike, to keep alive our sense of wonder.
Rachel Carson wrote a famous book called Silent Spring. Have you ever heard of it? She said a long time ago, she said all these chemicals we're producing that kill things, pesticides and herbicides and such, are all going to end up, killing everything, basically, in her book. And she won a lot of Nobel Prizes and such. Very famous.
So here in Sector Bay, there are two pretty distinct types of marshes. There are island marshes, which you can see here behind me. And there's also mainland marshes on the backside of Cape San Blas and then also on the actual mainland. And so we've noticed some pretty distinct differences between the two types over the last 2 summers when we've been out here. The islands obviously tend to be a little bit smaller, and they also have a sharper elevational gradient. So as you walk from the water's edge up, there's a much steeper incline than there is on the mainland sites. And because of that, the plant communities change over a much shorter area than they do in the mainlands. On the mainland sites, you'll have this large expanse of Spartina from the water's edge, and then gradually, as the elevation increases, you'll get additional plant species popping in there. Whereas on these islands, very quickly you'll get other species that are more terrestrial, less tolerant of flooding, that will be intermingling with the Spartina, the cord grass. There's also differences in the animal communities. The islands, because they're surrounded by water, tend to have lots of blue crabs and crown conchs kind of surrounding them. And we think as a consequence, there don't seem to be as many snails on the islands as on the mainlands, probably because their predators have greater access to these areas. In addition to fewer snails on the islands, we tend to see fewer kind of land-based animals. We definitely see fewer snakes on the islands than we do at our mainland sites, which makes everyone pretty happy. There do, however, tend to be more birds nesting on the islands, probably because their predators don't have access. There are other differences that we're hoping to tease apart, but these are kind of just some of the general patterns that we've observed while we've been out here.
That's what you can do if you study marine bio. You can go out there and work on a marsh island. Okay, so read through. You getting all this, Nyamka? You are not. You're sleeping. Read through page 280. And there could be a quiz. We only got 2 more days, so I only got a couple times to put in a quiz. And I want you to watch this 12-minute show on the Everglades. Anyone here ever been to the Everglades?
Yes.
This talks about this area the Everglades is one of the largest natural areas left in the world, and it's especially in this country. And it's got 2 parts to it. It's got swamp that's just fresh water, and then it's also got a lot of marsh where the salt water comes in. So it's kind of both, and they're working to preserve the Everglades, but it faces a lot of challenges. So I wanted you to see this.
Can I use the bathroom?
Yep.